And I think we have a lot of people here. I'd like to get started.
Are we ready?
I think we're ready.
All right. You want to pull up the PowerPoint, Tammy? All right, welcome everybody to the Wildfire Adapted Community Stakeholder Group meeting number 3. Next slide. I'm going to give a brief meeting overview. My name is Libby Bakke with Barney and Worth, and with me today are Tammy and Trish, and we are going to help facilitate the meeting. Next slide. This session is being recorded. Microphones are muted. There are 2 ways to engage, raising your hand and talking when you're called on, or chat. So we encourage throughout this whole meeting for you to do those things. Trish is monitoring the chat, and Tammy and I will be watching for hands up. There is a closed caption option. You see it on the bottom of the Zoom bar if that is needed. We're going to be doing some Zoom polling. If you go back 1 slide. And also, we wanted to let you know that if you have additional input, you can send it to Susan. Her email is included here, and Susan will put her contact information in the chat. Next slide. The chat feature is also on the Zoom bar. You click on chat. The message box will open up. You can type in a message. It will go to everyone. Next slide. And also raise hands can be found under reactions. If you click on reactions, you have tons of options. Raise hands is at the bottom. Next slide. Today, we're very excited that we have some guest speakers who are going to give overviews from their communities. We also are going to have 3 discussion topics. The first, enhancing protection measures and access to funding. The second will be addressing evacuation and access in local transportation plans. And the third is planning for access. And those discussions are set up so that DLCD will share a little bit of information. We will have a discussion. We will poll and have more discussion based on the outcome of that poll. So we're looking forward to hearing from everybody today. And again, close out with next steps. Next slide, Tammy. This stakeholder group, I just wanted to say again just how important it is for DLCD and how much they want to hear from everybody who's on this call. Everybody on this stakeholder group has a unique perspective, a unique lived experience, different levels of knowledge about this important topic, and the charge is to for the staff to hear from you and your recommendations about the work that they're doing. So that work is only going to get better with input and discussion and thoughts from this group. So today I'm going to make sure that everybody gets heard, that there's an opportunity for everybody to weigh in and ask questions and share their thoughts, and so that everybody can hear it and DLCD has a chance to learn and get more involved. So next slide, Tammy. Oh, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Great, thank you, Libby. Excuse me. Good morning. I'm Susan Milhauser, and I'm a natural hazards wildfire planner with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and the staff lead for the Wildfire Adapted Communities Project. So we're, as Libby said, we're really happy to have everyone here this morning, and your input during the meeting by email, in chat, any way that you can communicate with us. We will take your feedback as we're working through this process to develop our recommendations. Also, I know we've had a couple meetings together, but if folks do want to take a minute, you're welcome to put your name and affiliation in the chat. And again, we're glad to have you here today. And when we get to the kind of discussion point of our meeting, it would be wonderful if folks feel comfortable turning on your cameras as well when you're speaking. That would be very helpful. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Sadie Carney.
Thanks, Susan.
Next slide. Yep.
I just introduced myself in the chat. So for those of you that aren't looking at that, Sadie Carney, I'm a policy analyst and communications manager with DLCD. And I'd like to open our meeting with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the many tribes and bands who call Oregon their ancestral territory and honor the ongoing relationship between the land, plants, animals, and people indigenous to this place we now call Oregon. We recognize the continued sovereignty of the 9 federally recognized tribes who have ties to this place, and thank them for continuing to teach us how we might all be here together. Thanks. Next slide. So we touched on this in our first meeting and showed you the language that is pulled directly from section 11, which is the land use section of Senate Bill 762. But just to ground our conversation and remind people the legislative intent that DLCD is asked to respond to, we wanted to put this language on a slide where we could all read it together and sort of focus on where we're going in this regard. And then I have a couple of follow-up slides that I hope will be helpful as well. So DLCD is charged in Senate Bill 762. We are asked to identify recommended changes to the statewide land use planning program and local comprehensive plans and zoning codes. And we are asked to identify those recommendations to incorporate the wildfire risk map and minimize wildfire risk at a local level. And then there's a follow-on request of DLCD to include appropriate levels of state and local resources. Resources is kind of state agency code for how much money do you need or how many people do you need. And so how much money or how many people do we need to implement the recommendations that we are making at a local level and at a state level for them to be effective. And then section 11, I think it's 11.3 in the bill says recommended changes. And again, these are recommendations. This isn't rulemaking. These are recommendations, and I'll get back to this in a second. But the recommendations would precede anything that took the shape of a rule or a law at a local level. But DLCD's recommended changes may include, but need not be limited to, provisions regarding sufficient defensible space, building codes, safe evacuation, and development considerations in areas of extreme and high wildfire risk, allowing for regional differences. And I think this is a great kind of like context to lead us into our guest speakers, because I think we'll hear a lot about the ways that these different elements of protecting communities against wildfire play out and get incorporated at a local level for local governments that are already doing this work. Next slide, please. So in our last meeting, I mentioned that the Department of Justice had written a letter to DLCD, sort of outlining both DLCD's authority to write rules to help protect communities from wildfire or help create wildfire adapted communities. But then they also gave a little bit more detail on Senate Bill 762. And I know we had some folks that were very interested in that. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes to address it here. We will be hosting like the full letter, which really doesn't say too much more than what's on these slides, on our website with our background materials. But this is a direct quote. So nothing in section 11, which is the land use section of Senate Bill 762, constrains LCDC authority to adopt rules to implement Goal 7. And then areas subject to natural hazards is mine, but that's what Goal 7 is called. There is specific direction in section 11.2 to act to incorporate wildfire risk maps and minimize wildfire risk. And in section 11.3 to consider addressing subjects identified in the act. And so that is, as we saw on the previous slide, the sufficient defensible space, building codes, evacuation, and development considerations. So can we move to the next slide, please? So here, this is also called out in the guidance from DOJ. LCDC cannot adopt rules that are superseded by direction in Senate Bill 762. So we cannot adopt rules that specify the content of a public utilities risk-based wildfire protection plan, nor would we develop a statewide wildfire risk map, nor would we establish defensible space standards, nor would we establish wildfire hazard mitigation building code standards. We're asked to make recommendations in that regard. That is clear in the legislative intent, but we would not make those rules. That would be the purview of other agencies. Okay, next slide. And finally, you'll see this again at the end in kind of our timeline, but just to ground this group in where we are. So we are developing these recommendations and submitting them to the legislature and the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council by October 1st. And then the 2023 legislative session begins early in 2023. At that point, the Oregon legislature may pass or advance, we don't know, legislation that enacts some portion of recommendations received. Now, bear in mind the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, and there are some stakeholder group members here today who serve on the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council. Thank you for that important work. They are submitting their own recommendations in regard. So there'll be kind of like a companion piece that will come alongside the recommendations that DLCD. So the legislature will take all of that into consideration. They may decide to advance something in the form of further legislation to help protect Oregon communities from wildfire. And if that happens, then the legislation, if it passed, could direct DLCD to adopt rules related to wildfire. And then that rulemaking process that followed would again, probably in a more comprehensive fashion than this, just because I think I'm very hopeful that the timeline would be a bit more generous than the one that has been laid out with Senate Bill 762, but a rulemaking process would follow and there would be a broad community engagement process that accompanied it. So I just wanted to take us through DLCD's charge, touch on that DOJ advice or the guidance that we received, and then walk us through that timeline briefly at the beginning of this, and then we'll touch on the timeline again at the end. But I really don't want to take any more time away from our guest presenters because they have so much to offer this group. And so I will try to pay attention to questions in the chat, but I think we move to the next slide, which is where Susan introduces our guests.
Thanks, Sadie. There is one question in the chat So I don't know from Samantha if you want to answer that now, or maybe we can circle back to Samantha offline. It's up to you.
I can read it real quick. So Samantha wants to make sure that she understands that the slides are saying that DLCD does not have the authority to write rules related to building codes and defensible space. I don't know that that is necessarily true. We do not have the authority to establish building codes or defensible space standards. I think that the authority under Goal 7 may grant LCDC the latitude to adopt rules that reference building codes and defensible space, but certainly those would not be standards we would establish within the agency. I hope that's helpful.
All right, Susan, do you want me to kick off the community overviews, or are you ready?
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, so thanks, Sadie, and thanks, Libby. So as mentioned at the top of the meeting and on our agenda, we have some guest speakers this morning to talk about how in their communities they're addressing wildfire risk in a really comprehensive manner. So first up, we'll have Kyle Collins, who's an associate planner with Deschutes County, and Kyle is also a member of our stakeholder group, so we're really fortunate to have him joining us with his overall expertise. And just want to know, these are programs that these communities are doing now currently under state law. There may be some changes in the future with the implementation of Senate Bill 762 that could change the way some of these programs look in the future. But this is really just to give you all a sense of what a comprehensive wildfire mitigation program would look like at the city and county level. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kyle. Thank you.
I would like to encourage everybody to ask questions in the chat or put up their hands if you have questions along the way. And Kyle, I'm hoping that's okay, that you're up for questions along the way, and we'll have a time for discussion at the end of your presentation as well.
Sure, that sounds great.
Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. As Susan mentioned, my name is Kyle Collins. I'm an associate planner with the Deschutes County Community Development Department. Next slide, please. So before I jump into everything, I'm going to give kind of a big disclaimer about what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. The first disclaimer is that the two items that I'm really going to speak to are split between county-led initiatives. So these were things that specifically the Community Development Department of the county undertook directly. And the second item is actually an applicant-led initiative where the county was only a reviewing party in that instance. So it wasn't something that we specifically pressed for any set of rules or regulations or larger community development program, but we were the reviewing party and ultimately played more of an intermediary between various groups throughout Deschutes County. The second big disclaimer I want to point out is nothing I'm going to talk about here is a specific endorsement of anything from Deschutes County. Some of these were items that we ultimately started going down a path and did not actually wind up adopting anything at a local level, mostly because of 762 and the larger state wildfire mitigation program. And so I just want to point that out at the beginning to make sure there's no confusion into what I'm going to talk about. So next slide, please. So the first item I want to talk about is our Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee and a set of local code updates that we proposed to our Deschutes County Board of Commissioners over the past several years. Next slide, please. So this all began in 2015. We actually had an audit of our development code as it related to natural hazards from the University of Oregon's, what then was known as the Community Service Center. It's more recently known as the Institute for Policy, Research, and Engagement, I believe. So back in 2015, they actually combed through all of our code as it related to wildfire, but other natural hazards more broadly, and presented that audit to us. And we sat on it for several years up until about 2018 when we had enough resources and time available from our staff to go through that audit in detail and consider what changes might need to be made. That happened to coincide with an update from the State Building Codes Division to the Oregon Residential Specialty Code. Some of you might know this otherwise as R327, and it prescribed a specific set of fire hardening standards for any new construction statewide that could be voluntarily adopted by local communities if they so chose. Next slide, please. So in 2019, to further go through this code audit that was performed by the University of Oregon, our Board of County Commissioners appointed what was described as a Wildfire Mitigation Advisory Committee, or the WMAC. The WMAC consisted of 12 voting members. It was split between a pretty broad range of interests. So we had community development department staff there, members of our fire protection officials, kind of spread throughout the county, members of the development and building community, as well as just some private property owners within Deschutes County. And that WMAC committee held meetings for about 3 months at the end of 2019, spilling into the beginning of 2020. Next slide, please. So the purpose of that group really had two main objectives. The first was to review and recommend whether or not to apply R327, again, those voluntary fire hardening standards from the state building codes, in all areas under Deschutes County's building jurisdiction. And the second main objective was to review the code audit from the University of Oregon to see whether and where to propose any type of new land use regulations based on best practices from other jurisdictions and what was specifically recommended from the university. Next slide, please. So ultimately, after those 3 months of meetings, the WMAC produced a final report, and it came up with two broad recommendations. The first was there really wasn't agreement on whether or not any new building code standards should be implemented in Deschutes County. It was split roughly into three different groups. One group was gung-ho, wanted to implement these countywide, these fire hardening standards. The second group was largely opposed to any type of new building code standards. And the third members were split on whether or not they should actually be applied and what that might mean for future development in the county. Additionally, even if they were implemented, all the members of the WMAP were split on where those new standards should actually apply. Should they apply countywide? Should they have applied only in specific subdivisions, only on specific zoned properties or certain size properties? So that was a big point of contention and disagreement between this committee. The second big finding from that final report was that a majority of the WMAC members did agree that some type of defensible space standard should be put in place for all properties in Deschutes County, regardless of whether or not they were vacant or developed. Next slide, please. So to follow on from the WMAC committee and those recommendations in that final report, Deschutes County applied for and received a technical assistance grant from DLCD. Thank you, DLCD. To look at all of those recommendations from both the University of Oregon as well as the WMAC committee report and figure out how and if we should actually apply those into our comprehensive plan and any type of development code standards. So throughout the fall and winter of 2020, community development staff, we looked at a series of public outreach initiatives, mostly to gauge community interest around what the recommendations from the WMAC report were. Next slide, please. So based on those recommendations, we looked at two possible code amendments that we could potentially adopt countywide. The first was an update to our county building code, which would have required all new residential construction within our wildfire hazard zone, which covers the entirety of Deschutes County, to incorporate certain types of materials that would have prevented fire ignition more broadly. So again, this was entirely based on R327, the state building codes division, but it were required all sorts of things related to exterior wall coverings, roofing, ventilation, skylights, things of that nature. The second broad recommendation was an update to our county code that would have required defensible space for all rural residential properties. Next slide, please. So to get the public's feedback on those two proposals, we held a series of different outreach initiatives. As this was 2020, obviously the COVID pandemic had just kind of kicked off. And so we had 2 virtual open houses with our County Planning Commission to discuss the entirety of the project's history and the specifics of what we were looking to potentially add into our comprehensive plan and development codes. Next slide, please. The second is a statistically valid phone survey. We wanted something that we could really rely on from a professional agency that was used to doing these types of outreach initiatives. So we contacted Nelson Research Incorporated and ultimately had them reach out to Deschutes County residents to understand their general support of any type of mitigation code. Next slide, please. And then finally, to supplement that statistically valid survey, we actually came up with our own online survey and sent that out to all residents, again, asking them very similar questions related to possible code amendments. Next slide, please. So we had pretty good responses across both of those surveys. We had about 800 individual responses to our online survey and just under 400 responses to the statistically valid phone survey. So somewhere around 1,400 total responses to each of those, which we thought was a pretty good turnout. We wanted to sample pretty heavily towards rural areas. That's primarily our constituents being a county agency in this case. And we know that there was likely to be some discrepancies between what, let's say, urban residents might think of these possible code amendments versus rural residents. And so we wanted perspectives across the entire county, but we really wanted to focus more on rural residents, as that is who it was likely to affect. Next slide, please. So this is just a sample of one of the questions from our online survey. As you can see, this was related to fire resistant roofing materials and additional fire hardening standards for new construction. And as you can see, somewhere around 2/3 of respondents stated that they would support adding in those new building code standards. Another thing to point out is even if the undecided, you can see about 10% of respondents didn't know whether or not they supported this. But even if you combined, if all of those undecided participants stated that they did not want, ultimately, once they found out more about the program, to support them, there would still be a majority of support for that specific proposal. Next slide, please. The second question related to one thing we wanted to figure out was how much people were actually willing to take as a personal cost to implement these. We didn't know exactly how much fire hardening standards were going to add to new construction of a dwelling, for example. Went out, tried to find some relatively rigorous numbers from both the real estate and development communities, as well as our building safety division. And we came up with about $6,000 is kind of a good average of what we ultimately determined was a mid-range for what implementing fire hardening standards on new development might cost you. And interestingly, we found that a majority of residents were at least willing to undertake some additional cost to add these new features onto new development. As you can see here, roughly 45% or so of people were willing to spend up to at least $6,000, that kind of benchmark threshold. But an additional 30% of people were actually willing to spend above and beyond $6,000. So between those two, you're talking about, again, somewhere roughly in that 75% range, 2/3 to 75% range of people were willing to spend up to and above $6,000. Next slide, please. Last big question we talked about was defensible space. As currently written, following state law, defensible space is something that we already require in forest use zones, which is true everywhere in Oregon. And we asked if people were willing to basically expand those requirements for all new development in the rural county. And again, we found strong support across the majority of respondents to this proposal. About 60% of respondents said they would support some type of defensible space, even though we didn't know exactly what that proposal might look like when we were proposing this question. Next slide, please. So to kind of summarize all that, our residents in Deschutes County appear to be broadly supportive of wildfire mitigation code amendments. We couldn't give a lot of specifics on what that program might look like, for example, related to defensible space, because we hadn't developed a program at that point in time. This whole process was just to see if there was generalized support for trying to add in new development standards for any type of rural residential development, and people seemed to be supportive of that. Perhaps even more importantly was that it was true for both rural and urban residents. There was slightly more support among urban residents for some of these code standards, which is something I think we anticipated, but it really didn't make a huge difference between the total numbers of support that we ultimately found through this process, which was something that we were somewhat surprised by. Next slide, please. So taking all this together, that all finally occurred again back in kind of the late winter, early spring of 2021 was when we put together all of these findings into a big report to our Board of County Commissioners. And around that exact same time, Senate Bill 762 kind of popped up in the legislative session. And as we were tracking all of these kind of statewide bills, we presented that information to the board, but let them know that ultimately a larger state program might actually be coming down the pipe. And with that information, they elected to forego any further local code amendments, mostly given that a state program was likely to supersede our efforts anyway. And so it seemed like this was likely not the best time to try to produce something that would only apply to Deschutes County, given that in a year or two, if this were adopted, it would just go by the wayside. The one decision they did choose to make, however, was to maintain our currently adopted county wildfire hazard zoning map. Next slide, please. Which you can see here. So this was originally adopted back in 2001. As you can see, everything, it's not a great image quality because it's a relatively old figure, but it covers the entirety of Deschutes County. And the only thing that it currently controls is a prohibition on new wooden shake roofing in the county. So that was something that they actually did back in 2001, which we thought was relatively proactive at that point in time. Not something that a lot of people were thinking about in Oregon and particularly in the eastern half of the state. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move on to our applicant-led initiative that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. I'm going to talk about what we recently enacted as our West Side Transect zone. Next slide, please. So the West Side Transect zone specifically dealt with a suite of larger properties that were adjacent to the City of Bend's western boundary. Those properties were originally split between what we describe as our urban area reserve zone and a surface mining zone. And prior to adoption of the West Side Transect zone, it would have allowed for development densities of about 1 lot per 10 acres, primarily in the UAR 10 zone there. But ultimately, and more importantly for this process, the UAR 10 zone is designated for lots that are ultimately going to be pulled into the City of Bend's UGB. And so it really is kind of just a holding area for larger lots to still be developed while allowing for urban development as the City of Bend's UGB expands into those areas in the future. Next slide, please. So the Transect zone was proposed primarily to provide for a kind of transition area between the urban areas within the city, which is to the east of the Transect, as well as Shevlin Park, Tumalo Creek, and a suite of Deschutes County Forest Zone lands to the west. Shevlin Park and Tumalo Creek in particular are pretty important public assets for the City of Bend and Deschutes County writ large. There are a lot of designated park and open space tracts over there, and it's ultimately abuts to the Deschutes National Forest, which is along the City of Bend's western boundary. Next slide, please. So there was concern that these areas were ultimately going to be developed at some point in the future, regardless of when that was, to urban densities, and that was incompatible with what the resource values in the area were. So in 2019, the board approved a set of amendments to our comprehensive plan and the Bend Urban Growth Boundary Zoning Ordinance to create a new zone called the West Side Transect Zone. Next slide, please. And here you can see where the west side transect zone is. So in blue, it's split between two larger properties that's actually separated by a small extension of the City of Bend's UGB. You can see the green areas along the west associated with Tumalo Creek Canyon, as well as Shevlin Park and some other open space parcels surrounding that general area. Next slide, please. So the Transect zone, as I stated earlier, wasn't developed by Deschutes County directly. It was proposed by an applicant, and ultimately it was a piece of compromise legislation between property developers who wanted to maintain some type of assurance that they could develop portions of these properties, at least it's in the future, as well as conservation interests and property owners on the western boundary of Bend that had major concerns related to impacts on wildfire and wildlife habitat patterns primarily. So during this entire zone adoption process, we gave a lot of consideration to wildfire risk and mitigation, as well as a general transition to those natural areas that I stated earlier were adjacent to the City of Bend and are major public resources. People use Shevlin Park constantly. Next slide, please. So all future development within the newly adopted Westside Transect zone still allows for rural residential subdivisions, and it shrunk the overall parcel size to 2.5 acres. But each new rural residential subdivision is also required to have dedicated open space parcels and resource management corridors. And perhaps most importantly for this conversation, all land division proposals also have to have approved wildlife and wildfire protection plans that meet some very specific standards that are called out in the code. Next slide, please. So at a minimum, the wildfire protection plans that have to be developed for any new subdivisions are required to develop and maintain all residential lots with defensible space planning. So it's all based on the National Fire Protection Association Zone 1, 2, and 3 standards. If you're not familiar with these, they basically describe a set of linear distance out from any structures on site, and there's specific vegetation management standards for each of those rings, depending on the distance from wherever the structure is. Next slide, please. Second big piece that they have to have is all construction that occurs in the Transect zone has to utilize enhanced construction design and materials to prevent home ignition. So these are those fire hardening standards, very similar to R327 and ultimately based on those same R327 standards that the state building codes has put in place. Next slide, please. Third big requirement is that all the vegetation management is funded through a homeowners association and assessment, and it's ongoing on a yearly basis. So basically we have a forest management plan for each rural residential subdivision that goes on in the Transect zone. They identify where vegetation management has to occur, and then they have to provide an ongoing report to ensure on a yearly basis that those management procedures have actually been undertaken. Next slide, please. And then finally, an annual review of the plan itself and all of the conditions on the ground are required to be reviewed by a professional forester and submitted to Deschutes County as well as the homeowners association. So if anything changes in the plan, let's say conditions on the ground change, if there's some type of a wildfire, for example, that sweeps across one portion of the property and that forces a change in the wildfire management plan, that has to be undertaken and reviewed by a professional forester and then submitted to Deschutes County in order to formally place that into the new standards for the subdivision moving forward. Next slide, please. So one of the last big things that is not included in the wildfire protection plans directly as a requirement, but is included for all development within the Westside Transect zone is slope setback requirements. So a majority of these properties are adjacent to Tumalo Creek Canyon, which is an area that has seen wildfire in the past, and due to the steep topography presents its own unique risks. And so there's a specific setback from the edge of what we call the rim rock of Tumalo Creek Canyon of 30 feet for any new structures. And in this case, you can imagine rimrock is exactly what it sounds like if you're not familiar with that term. It's basically the upper ledge of rock associated with any type of steep geographic canyon or watercourse. Next slide, please. So since adoption of the Transect zone, we've actually had 2 subdivisions go through both master plan and tentative plan approval. The southern half, if you remember from that figure earlier, of the Transect zone has been divided into an 85 lot subdivision known as Westgate. And about half of the northern portion of the Transect has gone through approval of a 60 lot subdivision, which is known as Skyline Ranch. There's still at least one portion of the Transect, which is yet to go through any type of master plan and tentative plan. But again, both of these more recent subdivisions have gone through all of the steps that I pointed out earlier. So they've prepared wildfire protection plans that have been vetted by both a professional forester as well as us at the county level. And they've actually started treatment options and development on some of these lots. Next slide, please. So what that kind of looks like on the ground, this is a portion of the Transect on the south half. This is actually one of the resource management corridors, so there's no specific development that's occurring here. But this is what the vegetation management treatment. So this is ultimately a defensible space treatment on a portion of those resource corridors. And you can see relatively wide spacing between all the trees. There's been some mowing to reduce some of the brush, particularly some of the more flammable materials, rabbit brush, things of that nature. And the general goal is ultimately to prevent ignition across these broadly important landscapes, particularly given that there's pretty significant forest resources even further west from here. Next slide, please. This is actually a checklist from the Westgate Subdivision's Homeowners Association. They have contracted out with a professional forester. Every time someone proposes to build a new dwelling on one of these lots in the subdivision, they actually have to go through not only a review by our building safety division and our planning department, but they have their own HOA and architectural review committee conditions that they have to meet. So all these standards are based on that originally submitted wildfire protection plan for the whole subdivision. And they basically have to go through step by step to make sure that each of these has been vetted and approved and done properly before they get any type of final approval from their HOA and review committee. So you can see some of these are sort of the normal things that we talked about earlier, the fire hardening standards for the building itself. And some of them actually go above and beyond what we control at a local development code level. So things like firewood storage, things like driveway access, for example, that specifically deals with wildfire hazard mitigation, revegetation of any things that might be lost in a fire or removed specifically by the property owner. So there's a pretty broad range of items that if you buy a lot in this area, there's a lot that you have to do. And a lot of that is related specifically to wildfire hazard mitigation. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll open it up to any general questions. But again, those are 2 big projects that we've undertaken over the last roughly 6 to 7 years. I think it's in some ways been an interesting process seeing 762 come into place and effectively remove all of our local efforts. But it is interesting to see in some ways we were on the forefront of what was likely to occur statewide.
Kyle, I have a question for you.
Of course.
What did implementation look like? Was there any, how did it go? How many subdivisions went through the process or?
For the West Side Transect zone?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So implementation was ultimately, once the zone was adopted, it actually went relatively smoothly because in some ways there were only 3 property owners within the Transect zone. It was split between 3 large properties. And so they were well aware of all the requirements before they even got to kind of a master plan and tentative plan stage, because they were a part of that collaborative process of developing what standards were going to go into the zone proposal at that point in time. So it really was, once the Transect zone was adopted, it was probably within 6 months that there was on the ground ready to go master plan. They had already had their wildfire protection plans established and vetted by a forester. And so things went relatively smoothly from that point.
Great. We have a question from Mary Kyle.
Thanks. On the first part of your presentation on what you all were considering for the rural residential areas, did that include, and this doesn't apply to all counties, but it would impact Deschutes and some other counties, did that include the destination resorts? Or is there does that give one a county the ability to have something more comprehensive, like an overlay for resorts? Anyway, how did you treat destination resorts? And Sun River is a community. I'm thinking, anyway, I wasn't thinking just necessarily of Sun River. I was thinking of the other destination resorts, because Sun River is sort of its own thing. Any of that you can answer?
No, absolutely. Yeah, Sun River is technically not a destination resort
Right.
in the strict sense. It's more of an unincorporated community at this point in time, just because of the age of the development.
Right. So I assume what you're talking about would have applied to them.
The short answer is we never actually got that far.
Right.
It was just an open-ended question on whether or not any type of rural residential development should have applied defensible space standards. The more open-ended question is where that should have applied. One option that we gave to our board is technically there was a lot of latitude in relation to both R327, at least as it was previously adopted, with those voluntary agreements, as well as any type of defensible space program that we might have come up with. So, for example, we could have said, well, this only applies on lots that are less than 5 acres in size, or only applies to new development rather than replacing existing development. So those were just general ideas that we were tossing up, but ultimately, once 762 was passed, we never really moved forward with any more specific details of a program that might have been put in place.
So you didn't get to the point of thinking about, it seems to me destination resorts, because of how they're developed and owned and all of that, can offer some ways to do things comprehensively that might provide counties some additional tools, or, anyway, a code provision that just applies to destination resorts in addition to other rural residential areas that you might do something different with, but you didn't get to that point, it sounds like.
No, we never actually got to that point. But to follow on to your question, a lot of the standards that came into the West Side Transect zone, and specifically, were actually pulled out of some processes that a destination resort in Deschutes County had already undertaken, as well as some other more recent cluster subdivisions that had happened again on that western edge of Bend. And so we were kind of taking ideas from wherever we could get them ultimately to put these in place.
And the West Side Transect zone will ultimately come in. Is it inside has it been annexed by Bend? Is it in the city limits?
The entire goal is to have it effectively never be annexed by Bend. So it has been removed from that urban area reserve zone, which I mentioned in my presentation, because the whole idea was to allow for development in this area at a density that would still satisfy builders and developers and property owners in the area, but allow for a more natural transition to those open spaces on the western edge of Bend. So while it can be developed more densely than it was on its previous zoning, it will never be developed, most likely. I obviously don't know what will happen 100 years from now, but it will never be developed at a density specifically related to urban standards.
Okay, that's helpful. It's not going to run into Bend code at some point then.
Correct.
Well, at least as envisioned today. Thank you.
Kyle, I had another question that we've heard a lot from this group during our meetings about the requirement here to develop and maintain all residential lots in compliance with the National Fire Protection Association standards. Was there consideration about monitoring? That's come up a lot with this group.
In relation to, yes, I would say that was a huge consideration. So the way we ultimately considered the two possible code amendments that we were proposing was the building code standards in R327 is relatively easy to think about implementing and maintaining over time, because it's basically, if you're building something, it's checked by our building safety division, and it's literally just checking a box to make sure you met the standards. Defensible space standards is kind of a whole different beast. It's a little bit difficult to imagine how we would have put this in place and maintained it over time, particularly given that our code compliance division is largely related to voluntary compliance for the most part. We simply don't have the resources to have hundreds of people out on the ground checking every individual lot. And if 762 had never been implemented and we did ultimately elect to move forward, that probably would have been where the rubber met the road in terms of how do we get this implemented on the ground? Is there some sort of phase-in period? Would we have a several years of actually going and doing a lot of outreach for individual property owners and saying, here's these new standards. Is there any funding that we could have provided to help people? That was another big concern that came up with a lot of rural residents is how can I possibly afford to do this, specifically if I have a 10-acre property and you're asking me to do some pretty significant fuel treatments. And it's not like it's a one-time deal. It's something you're going to have to do on at least every few years. So that definitely came up a lot. I can't say that we had a lot of solutions to that problem because we, again, never really got to that point.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. Are there any other questions, comments?
We do have one in the chat.
Okay.
The question is, were potential climate change impacts included in the planning and decision-making process? For example, higher temperatures and drier conditions are stressing conifers. What will be the response when high tree mortality events occur?
Yeah, in some ways it was, I would say specifically in the WMAC committee discussions. So one of the big things that happened in that I didn't call out in my presentation, but I can speak to a little bit was there were a lot of questions about should our wildfire hazard overlay zone be more related to specific physical conditions like topography and vegetation and climate to more dial in where a wildfire was likely to occur. So we had a lot of different iterations of maps. Some of them were very granular down to effectively a parcel level that said this half of your parcel is more subject to wildfire conditions as we understand them versus this half. And ultimately, the decision was made that that level of granularity wasn't all that useful. We kind of came to the conclusion, as I pointed out at the end of my presentation, that because we already have an adopted wildfire hazard zone map that covers the entirety of the county, that probably covered all the bases enough to meet most of our standards. There was always suggestions that we could add in exceptions for, let's say, existing development or substandard lots, things that would still allow you to make changes in individual property by property considerations. But we live in Deschutes County and we know that fire is a thing here and is likely to affect basically everywhere. That's kind of the reality of where we live. And I think most people understand that enough, even without factoring in something like climate change. It's basically that, is it going to be bad or is it going to be really bad? Those are kind of the two options.
Thank you, Kyle. Susan, do you want to introduce the Ashland presentation?
Thank you, Libby. So next up, we have two staff members from the city of Ashland who are joining us today. We have Chris Chambers, who's the wildfire division chief for the city, as well as Brandon Goldman, who is the planning manager for the city of Ashland. And they're going to give you an overview of their comprehensive program.
Yeah, and again, I want to encourage people to put questions in chat or raise your hand during these presentations.
Thank you guys for the opportunity to speak to this issue. It's one that the city of Ashland has wrestled with for many years. Our first wildfire hazard overlay area, I think, was adopted in the early 90s that did include prohibitions against wood shingled roofs and some fuels management practices. But in 2014, the city embarked on an effort to revisit that wildfire development standards. And I'm let Chris Chambers speak to the efforts that we began with back in 2014 in the comprehensive approach to wildfire standards. So next slide, and thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Brandon, and thank you for having us here, everybody. It's really, it's actually a pleasure to see this process roll out, having been on the original Governor's Wildfire Council. It is so encouraging to see these conversations happening in all different aspects of what was adopted in Senate Bill 762. So it's just, it is really exciting. And I know it's challenging, but I know also that we are making progress, especially in light of what happened in 2020 across Oregon. So thanks, Brandon, for that introduction and reflecting that Ashland had indeed had a wildfire hazard zone overlay in place since the 1990s. I think a really forward-looking move was made by the fire chief at the time after seeing what happened in the Oakland Hills fire and looking at the Ashland Hills, which you see behind me in my screen background, and noting the similarities between the two. And in my time here since 2002 and working in the Ashland interface, I started noticing things that were really concerning to me, and seeing fires start all across the city. And you're going to see a map of that in Brandon's section of the presentation, that we're well outside of our defined wildfire hazard zone area. And then also working in that zone and, standing in the middle of the street and looking at one side of the street and saying, well, that's a wildfire hazard zone, but the other side of the street isn't. And essentially there was no difference in the vegetation profile and what was being planted in urban landscapes and how more natural landscapes or fuels were being managed in those areas. And so that really got me thinking and talking to fire chiefs over time, and as well as our fire marshal at the time, Marguerite Hickman, and thinking about an expansion and how badly that was needed. And as time went on, and then Brandon mentioned that we started really getting into this conversation in 2014. We, with climate change happening, we started seeing this destruction happening across the West and really across the country, not only in the West, of entire communities. What went from the commonly understood vernacular of forest fires really evolved into wildfires. So fires that we used to think of, especially in Oregon, as just burning in the forest. Oh, and it might affect a house out there somewhere, and that people that live in the forest, to now we have wildfires that are destroying entire communities down to their urban cores. So that is alarming, and we have all now seen that very up close and personal in Oregon. And of course, here in Southern Oregon with the Alameda fire starting in Ashland and then burning through the urban core areas of Phoenix and Talent and as our local example, although we had already done our code adoptions before that fire, thankfully. One of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about is why it was so important for us to do that. We were spending a lot of time, staff time, effort, grant money, trying to reduce the flammability of our existing building stock. We have well over, I don't know, Brandon could probably quote the exact number. It's well over 6,000, maybe it's closer to 8,000 housing units inside the city limits of Ashland. And the vast majority of those were constructed pre-code. And even those that were built in the wildfire hazard zone overlay that was adopted in the 90s had kind of lax enforcement. And indeed, we're probably not meeting the standards as we were thinking about this in 2014. So reflecting that, as we were investing all this time and money to reduce the flammability of existing structures, meanwhile, we don't have a code that was addressing flammability of the newly built structures. So at the same time as we're trying to dig ourselves out of the hole, somebody else is making the hole deeper. So we knew we had to put a stop to that. And as we went through our entire town, we rated the risk of every structure. That took us a couple years of cobbling together staff time and grant funding to do. We were able to see the pattern of wildfire risk across Ashland. And although it is concentrated at the tops of the city where we have the interface with our forested areas and slopes are steeper, there is appreciable risk along the Bear Creek frontage at the bottom of the town, and pockets of a higher risk in areas throughout the city. both because of landscaping that's installed around people's houses that's flammable, and as those lots are linked together with this flammable landscaping, creating swaths of really high risk that are connected, and also homes bordering more natural areas, riparian zones in particular, which we saw burn at very high intensity during Almeda. We knew were going to be high risk. And actually there was a front page article with a picture of me standing at the bottom of the city near the city's wastewater treatment plant. This was back in 2014, which ironically became the ignition point of the Almeda fire. And the point of the picture was saying we need to expand our zone because we're not including these areas that are high risk, that are at the bottom of the city of Ashland. And sure enough, that's where our most destructive fire in state history started. So we embarked on this process because we realized through both data collection and experience that some changes were indeed needed. Next. This is just showing, that codes are part of a broader approach to creating a fire adapted community. A very expanded version of this, what we call the fire adapted communities wheel, can be found let's see, what's the, if I don't know the website offhand, but it's Fire Adapted Communities Network website. So you can see all the various elements that are kind of in the recipe or the toolkit for fire adapted communities. And these are some of ours as we were thinking about adopting the code, which was also to show to our policymakers, the city council, that adopting code wasn't just something done in isolation. It's something that's done of a comprehensive program to become fire adapted. Next. So elements of that approach, indeed expanding the wildfire lands overlay, and Brandon's going to talk more about that. That eventually did include the entire city limits of Ashland, updating our wildfire lands ordinance, and then adopting the a municipal code restricting plantings of the prohibited, what we call the prohibited flammable plant list, which, by the way, the leaves at the side of the presentation are probably something that we would not want planted around homes that are dry and flammable. So next time, Brandon, we'll have to change our presentation to include a more fire-wise plant motif. And then moving on through that code adoption process to the R327, which also Brandon's going to talk about. And then also reflecting that we need to keep working on our existing building stock to lower the flammability, both in those neighborhoods where we don't have new construction, but also in neighborhoods where we border areas of new construction, because we were trying to achieve parity. So if somebody was building a new house to a wildfire code, that the house across the fence from them that was pre-existing had to meet some kind of standard, and they couldn't just plant a flammable row of, say, Leland cypress to screen out their new neighbors who just built their house, which would not have been very fair. We do have a very active Firewise USA program, which I'll talk about toward the end. And we have created a citywide grant incentive program through a FEMA pre-disaster mitigation grant, which is being rolled out right now. That's a $3 million, actually a $4 million 3-year effort. We're in our 6 months of that. Thank you for the fireadapted.org link, Susan, much appreciated. And then I'll also mention at the end a little bit more about education and outreach on our evacuation planning and implementing our zone effort across the city of Ashland. All right, Brandon is gonna take over from here.
And so with that, I'll go through these modifications relatively quickly. Essentially, in order to look at our existing wildfire overlay or wildfire hazard zone, it originally incorporated really just the steepest areas of Ashland at that forest interface. But in 2014, there was a evaluation of all the areas within the city of Ashland and looking at the criteria set forth for wildfire hazard zones. Next slide, please. And in that, the city was broken into 16 distinct neighborhoods, and looking at all the elements that go into the wildfire risk as far as topography, the native vegetative fuel distribution were all quantified in order to determine the risk posed to each of those neighborhoods. Next slide. And this is a map that was created with the help of Ashland Fire and Rescue that shows where between, I think 1973 and 2018, where ignitions within the city of Ashland for fires had occurred. And as you can see on this map, the pink area was our prior wildfire hazard area, and it actually had less ignition sources within that area than the rest of the city. Although the city is, an urban area, small lots, there are vacant properties, riparian corridors, and the town in its entirety is surrounded by either forest or grasslands. So those ignition sources all pose significant risk. Next slide, please. So in consideration of that evaluation, the city, again in 2018, proposed and ultimately adopted an expansion of the wildfire lands overlay, which is housed within our land use ordinance under the physical environmental constraints section. And with it comes limitations in terms of, essentially the creation of new properties that subdivisions in those areas would have to address our wildfire standards, both in terms of fuel management as well as access requirements. And so then applying that citywide did have implications in terms of going from what were relatively large lots to small lots. Next slide, please. And specifically, as we were looking at our wildfire lands overlay ordinance, it was an opportune time to revisit what was working and what wasn't working and make amendments to that, as well as to reflect on how it could be applied to established neighborhoods that were relatively small. Right out of the gate, we start by looking at the 30-foot buffer area around all structures. And, where that works on singular properties where a house is in the center of a large lot, in the case of 5,000 square foot lots throughout the community, we found that buffer area would incorporate essentially the vast majority of the city, that few lots would have any land that would be outside of that buffer area. So it was clear that we needed to address existing vegetation and proposed vegetation in those areas. And so as part of the land use amendments, we did require for a distinction between new developments and additions to existing structures, and the application of fire prevention and control plans, general fuel modification, as well as establishing a list of plants that could not be newly planted within the city, within that overlay area, or within the city as a whole. Next slide, please. So the general fuel management area really gets to, if somebody builds a new building or a new deck that's over 200 square feet or an addition, they're in a position to, at that point, look at the existing fuels on their property and address them. So next slide, please. As part of that, and I know this slide might be a little difficult to read, it's part of a handout that was developed in order to provide to people a very clear way to represent what's included in the ordinance. But there's requirements in terms of keeping tree branches away from chimneys, spacing trees so that they're 10 feet apart between outermost branches, looking at minimum vertical clearance between understory vegetation and the bottom of trees. I know that most in this group are probably familiar with a lot of these requirements. Our community as a whole was not, and so that's where the having the materials like this to give to developers when they're considering a new subdivision, or even single-family homeowners when they're looking to protect their property, of what kind of fuel mitigation they can do. And so, again, the Class B or better roofing material is required. One issue that comes up quite a bit that was adopted as part of this standard, newly adopted, was a requirement that fences attached to a structure have to be non-combustible material or ignition resistant in that sense. So in this illustration, you'll see under that number 8, a metal gate that is attaching to the house. And so this is applied to all new fence permits. And, just as an aside, I find that having a standard like this actually has worked even when people were not subject to a new development, seeing the requirement and it being implemented on neighbors' property. We do get people that are coming into our office to replace their fence because they now recognize the hazard that a solid wood fence goes up to the house. So that education and outreach component, I think, has dividends outside even new development proposals. Next slide. So a fire prevention and control plan goes a little bit further than the general fuel modification in that for subdivisions and land partitions or commercial or multifamily developments, they are required to develop a plan that shows not just new landscaping and what vegetation will be removed, but also provide ongoing maintenance. And so that is one of those issues that wasn't fully addressed in our prior code, but is now addressed, that a fire prevention and control plan would have a schedule for thinning and removal, because we all know that an area can be treated and then a number of years goes by and it needs to be treated again. So this then becomes established through in subdivisions and a homeowners association requirements for maintenance of those open space on a regular schedule. Next slide. The prohibition of highly flammable plants was again applied citywide because it applies everywhere where the wildfire hazard zone is. And we did wrestle with the concern in terms of going into established neighborhoods and requiring a removal of all vegetation that was considered highly flammable within 30 feet of a building. And so this actually applied citywide to preclude the planting of new highly flammable plants in those areas. Chris mentioned the hole that we could get into. So this was a way to really stop that future incursion of flammable plants within established neighborhoods, and further required the removal of any flammable plants within 5 feet of a structure when a addition or a deck or something was added. So that is a new provision as illustrated in the visual there. Next slide. So development of this prohibited flammable plant list was assisted in large part by members of the local landscaping community and landscape architects that assisted the city in going through what is both commonly planted in the city as well as those plants that were identified as highly flammable. And so as part of this, we didn't want to have a list that was established in perpetuity and could not be changed. So there is allowances within the code for an annual review of the list to modify it to add new plants that may not have been explicitly listed. But essentially this covers a large part of, neighborhood concern in terms of the introduction of that row of Leland cypress between one house and another, that would not be allowed going forward in the city. Next slide. And so although we adopted all these wildfire code standards in 2018, it wasn't until 2019 that R327.4 was available for our jurisdiction to look at and adopt. And it did take a bit of time to adopt it, but we did so in June of 2021. That then applies citywide and allows for that fire resistant or ignition protected materials on homes. And next slide. And again, I'm sure you guys can all go directly to the source in terms of the building code requirements, but it did address not just roofing, which was previously addressed, but now covers rain gutters, vents, exterior wall coverings, overhangs, walking surfaces, window doors, etc. So definitely an enhancement to our local building code to have adopt that section in order to, again, put forth to the building community unified standards that could apply in City of Medford, City of Ashland, in order of moving forward with building that is better protected from wildfire. So next slide. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to talk about some of the incentive programs that the city has. So Chris.
Thanks, Brandon. One of the elements that I just mentioned in passing, I talked about the FEMA grant program. We're about 7 months into FEMA grant program. We have completed defensible space on 56 lots. There are 40 in progress. And also that FEMA program is an incentive program to get rid of wood shake roofing across the community. So we know, again, we are able to prohibit the roofing through the zoning and codes, but the existing flammable roofing, we were actually able to roll into this FEMA grant. And we have done 4 roof replacements now. We're giving up to $10,000 credit towards roof replacements. Often they cost a heck of a lot more than that, but it's certainly a nice incentive for folks to get that money back when they replace with a, I think the FEMA requirement is for a Class A or better. Well, Class A is the best, so Class A roof replacement. And we actually, we only ended up with 24 roofs that we're targeting. So it actually feels pretty doable. We started our Firewise program in 2010, right on the heels of a fire, the Oak Knoll fire that burned 11 homes inside the city of Ashland, damaged several others. We'd actually had the program starting, and then that fire certainly propelled it. At various times, we've had the most Firewise communities of any one municipality in the country. We have 34 communities right now who are active in the Firewise USA program. It has a lot of benefit. It has some drawbacks as well. I'm not going to go into all that right now, but we're really trying to push these communities towards self-governance so that we don't have to spend a lot of staff time on the upkeep and maintenance of Firewise communities. But as you can see from the map, they're very distinct. They're in different places around Ashland. But we also leave out a lot of the area of town. And so one of the things we're trying to do now is be a little bit more holistic in our view of trying to reduce fire hazards around Ashland. If people want to organize into a Firewise USA community, great. We encourage them to do that. We'll help them to get there. But we also want to use all the tools in the toolbox to address the vast majority of the area of Ashland that are not in Firewise communities. And most of our Firewise communities are homeowners associations. So they have an existing organization and they have some self-governance and they're able to participate in that program fairly easily. The unincorporated neighborhoods are more difficult to get into Firewise. And so we don't look to that model to solve all of our problems. Next. So transitioning to a little bit about evacuation, because I know that's part of the discussion here, and it's something we've done a lot of work on in Ashland. We installed these wildfire evacuation route signs back in 2004 as a result of a Title III grant from Jackson County. I did a lot of canvassing also in that project and came up with a plan. Things have changed since then. And actually, I think I might be an advocate of taking down these signs, except where absolutely needed these days, reflecting that we really don't know where a wildfire is going to come from. And if we have dedicated routes, we may actually end up sending people into harm's way if they're following these signs and the fire happens to be in an area where we're trying, where you would be sending people via the signage. So we've definitely changed that approach. If you could forward to the next slide. And instead of just having dedicated routes, we've gone to the zone concept, as many communities and counties are moving towards throughout Oregon. We have a 10 zone approach now. This was implemented last year so that we can more easily call out evacuation areas, and people can actually interact via our website with their zone on an online map format. They can see all of the exit and egress routes from their zone, how to get in and out. maybe the way that they drive into to get home and to shopping and various activities every day is not their primary evacuation route. Maybe there are other better routes, and really they should know all the routes in and out of their zone. So should a fire threaten from any direction, we would be able to get them safely out using our notification system so that people can get real-time instructions from emergency managers during an event, so we can tell them which direction to go. So we have changed our evacuation approach a little bit over time, in part learning for what other communities have gone through during evacuations. And I think this just makes a lot more sense. And this was in part due to a study that we commissioned, which is the next slide. Through a state grant from OEM, we were able to commission this study from an engineering group. They're actually from New York, but they do a lot of evacuation modeling around nuclear facilities, but also in wildfire-prone communities. What this report did, and this is all available at ashland.or.us/evacuate. You can see the presentation there from the engineering group, KLD. You can see the recommendations that were made. You can read the whole report if you want to. We did learn a lot from this about how long it would take to evacuate not only individual zones or groups of zones, but should we have to, the entire community of Ashland. And it also came with a survey sent out to residents, which we had many thousands of responses to try to gauge what are people's concerns about our evacuation program, how long is it going to take them to get out of their homes. And from all that information, we're able to develop some education and outreach strategies that address both weaknesses in our transportation network, one of which was already solved, which we installed an emergency on-ramp to Interstate 5 along North Mountain Avenue, where the city just touches that I-5 corridor, and we don't have an exit, a formal exit, an on-ramp, an off-ramp anywhere in the middle of Ashland. So this allows one alternate exit, and that came out of this study, and it's already been implemented for this fire season. So we're excited to have that, which only helps to reduce evacuation times across the city so that we have that portion of the city that can go a different direction. So that's just one example of some of the recommendations that came out of this report that we've been able to use, and something I think is worthwhile for communities to consider this type of evacuation time estimate study, looking at their transportation network. So with that, I think that's all that we've got to talk about, and happy to answer questions either for Brandon or myself. And I do appreciate the partnership, working with Brandon in community development. It's really, I think, important to have those partners across our different disciplines within organizations, and I think it shows a united front. So thank you, Brandon. Look forward to more conversations as things develop here in Ashland.
Trish, are there some questions in chat?
There are a couple. Let's start with, I'm curious how the evacuation zone approach would scale up to a county or regional scale. Any examples of counties taking this approach?
Great question, and I've got a great answer. Jackson County is engaged in that right now. I'm actually the zone captain for South Jackson County, and helping to get our surrounding areas on board with their zones. So through the state in a pilot program, both Jackson County and Deschutes County are piloting a software called Zone Haven. And through Zone Haven, there are all kinds of tools. You can look up Zone Haven and how it's being used in many other states. But in our two counties, we are proceeding with zoning out the entire county. Zone Haven has a process that will actually propose zones using an algorithm, and then individual communities within the county need to go through and verify those zones first. And I will say we just met on that last week, and some of the zones just don't make any sense as proposed, but it's a great starting point. We're adjusting those zones right now. And so by the heart of this fire season, we will have all of Jackson County zoned out. And so Ashland is not in isolation in that. We'll have county zones abutting us on all sides. So the county can also incorporate that into their evacuation noticing.
Maybe we can open it up. It looks like we have a very long list of questions in the chat. Let's open it up to see if other folks have questions really quick.
Go with the chats, Trish. Oh, there are some questions.
Yeah, it looks like
Yeah, I
Mary
think
Kyle.
Mary Kyle has her
Okay,
hand up.
okay.
I just had one simple one. There's longer ones in the chat. It looks like
Yeah.
for either presenter, this is really interesting. Thank you very much. I think this provides a lot of information that we can look at. I gather that when the term structure was used throughout both presentations, it was almost always meaning residential structures, but just maybe going in the future, that would be useful to clarify as we're hearing from presenters. And on the list of around the issue of highly flammable vegetation and how that kind of connects the highly flammable areas as a runway for fire, et cetera. Are those is that vegetation prohibited on all types in all zones, not just residential? That's where that distinction between what's just on residential or new residential versus what's prohibited or regulated everywhere would be useful. So taking the prohibited vegetation and highly flammable vegetation.
The prohibited and highly flammable plant list is applicable citywide, regardless of whether it's commercial, residential, employment, industrial. They can't be newly planted within 30 feet of a structure. And a structure could be an accessory building, primary house, could be a bank. So
right.
Again, it's all development essentially of 200 square feet or more that would trigger the requirement to remove flammable vegetation within that 30 feet. Or if it is an existing property that isn't subject to development, they cannot newly introduce those plants anywhere within the city.
Thank you.
I'm going to take my hand down to defer to Tanner, and I see a question from Kelly O'Neill in the chat.
Sadie, you're welcome to go first. What will you have to say, Mike? All right.
I live here. Come on.
All right, sounds good. I think it would be valuable. I'm hoping to kind of summarize my understanding, and I'm hoping that getting clarification on my understanding will kind of benefit others, and kind of wrapping up kind of how these presentations can be translated to kind of the conversation moving forward. So first of all, thank you for everyone for the presentations. Those are really good. Both communities seem to be doing a lot of good work and seem to have good processes for kind of figuring out what to do in their communities. So seems like we've had some good examples on kind of community level approaches. And based on my understanding, so kind of walking it back, there's kind of two approaches that can kind of come out of the work that's being done here. So obviously there's going to be a report that's going to result in potential legislation and rulemaking that would affect Oregon. So 762, obviously out of that we had ODF developing a map and defining the WUI. We also have DCD and OSFM handling ignition resistant construction and defensible space. So that's under their authority. Building departments have the authority on what happens to a building and building construction. OSFM, as far as 762 is concerned, will have authority on defensible space. Locally and at a state level, it seems like planning can take into account whether or not development is allowed in reference to those items. So At a local level, there's some examples, and even locally in Medford, I see this too. There's rules in place that if you don't have some of the building stuff and some of the defensible space stuff that may or may not be under the planning department's authority, that can limit your development. And I'm seeing Sadie's head nod, like that's okay. So even with 762, that's like statewide, state level. There's going to be those kind of minimum standards. There's also the local path. So even with the defensible space that OSFM is doing, locals can still kind of do their own thing or continue to do their own thing over and above what that is. 327, the building stuff, I believe on the building side, it's mini maxi code. So versus on the fire side, it's minimum level of safety. So locals can go over and above and beyond the defensible space requirements. On the building side, you can't. So there's R327, once BCD does their thing as far as 762 on that, whether you're a local or at the state level, that's it. That's the standard that for ignition resistant construction. A local department, a local agency could say, hey, we're going to take the statewide map and possibly take the statewide map and say, hey, even in moderate areas, we want to see 327 applied. And that's not necessarily a statement, it's more of a question that it might be helpful to kind of fish out. But so taking what locals can do and applying that to the statewide level, this process or the result of this process is going to be a report that says, okay, what can we do at a statewide level planning wise to say, based on the defensible space stuff that we know is going on and the ignition resistant construction stuff that we know is going on, we're going to take that and consider that in overall planning rules that apply potentially throughout the state. And so there might be some of this stuff that's minimum levels across the state, or to kind of go along with the questions that might be, here's some guidance, and then locals, you figure out based on your area, your needs, how this is going to apply. I'm seeing Susan's head nod. So I just wanted to kind of get that understanding of the potential ways that this can go and maybe some practical examples. Because I think for the poll that you guys sent out, there were some really great questions, but without knowing what can DLCD and LCDC do, what rules can be adopted, we can do this or we can do that. I think having some practical examples of where we can go would help, at least for me, from my understanding, in responding to some of those questions and some of those polls and taking the information in and understanding how it could practically be applied. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. And hopefully that was correct. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanner. It made sense to me. I imagine that there might be a few people it left behind because your knowledge is very in depth. But generally, I've found everything that you said is correct, and I'll get to the question at the end, and hopefully other folks are tracking, and I'm happy to touch base with you one-on-one if I don't fully answer this question. And it may be something that our local planners want to weigh in on, because certainly they know how local implementation works much better than I do. So to the assumption about building standards at a local level, I think as the standards that are defined for R327 in Senate Bill 762 are put in place by building codes, they will apply only to areas that are defined as extreme or high risk on the WMAC map. And so, as I understand, the way it is right now, local communities will not have the authority to further extend the applicability of those building codes. And so they would be limited to applying them to areas that were in extreme or high wildfire risk, within kind of like the legislative construct of Senate Bill 762 and the interpretation of the Building Codes Division. And then to kind of the bigger question of what can we do, what could be done. LCDC does have fairly broad rulemaking authority under Goal 7, and that would allow us to provide guidance for local governments to put in place something like Ashland or Deschutes County has put in place. It could also come with grants and stuff like that. It's not just rules, but it's really everything that would kind of fall under Goal 7, which is the protection of people and property. But that said, the statewide land use planning program, a couple of things. One, it is all community-driven planning processes that come through the statewide land use planning program, right? You have to have public involvement the whole way. Also, the implementation of land use planning at a local level is designed to be flexible to fit the community. And so we may have state level guidance, but the way that it looked at a local level would vary depending on need. Does that come close to answering your question?
Yeah, and so maybe a couple of examples. So like locally, there's local planning rules in the county that require fuel setbacks, fuels mitigation. So a fuel break. So it's kind of along the defensible space framework. And basically it says you can't develop unless you have a 100-foot fuel break, and or you get approval from the local fire authority saying that you can go less. So that could be an example that either at the state or local level, that could be a you can't develop unless you are meeting defensible space. Okay, and then maybe another example, and this kind of ties with one of the questions from Samantha with OHBA. So as another example, I know DLCD and LCDC under the climate friendly and equitable areas, I think, considered, had some rules and maybe even some guidance on roadway widths to kind of follow up with Samantha's question, considering capacity, especially for evacuation in wildfire areas. You know, I like one of the guidelines in there was 28 feet with parking on both sides, and we know that's not enough for safe evacuation plus emergency response. That only leaves about 14 to 16 feet available width, and it's just not enough. So the state could, or a local planning department could say, hey, we want this minimum width in wildfire areas for safe evacuation. That would be possible.
Sadie, I'd let you, you're muted. I'll let you ask them. We've got more text or more, messages coming in too with
Yeah,
questions. I just want to make sure.
I think that kind of granularity is something that we would get to in a rulemaking process. And right now we're really just trying to gauge kind of overall values. And so it's a little bit like, maybe, sure, but it depends on where we land in terms of determining the goals and values of kind of the state overall and this stakeholder group in our recommendations. And then what's reflected from there when we get into the specifics like road widths, that's not, you know, we might identify in our recommendations the need for effective evacuation at a community-wide level in a time frame that, you know, allows for the greatest, you know, whatever, effective. But we wouldn't get down to something like road widths at the recommendation level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I apologize for kind of not making that clear. So I mean, yeah, obviously there's gonna be recommendations that come out of this, and then eventually down the road it'll go to rulemaking, but that rulemaking has the potential to say, for example, in map wildfire areas, higher extreme or even moderate higher extreme, we're going to require 2 egress points and a minimum roadway width of X. That's possible. That's within the.
It is within the realm of
Okay.
possibility and within, I think, LCDC's authority to dictate such, yes.
I want to make
Okay,
sure
awesome. Thank
we have questions in the chat, and Mary Kyle has her hand up, and Samantha, I wanted to say those are all great questions. We might not be able to get to all of them today, but after we take our break, we will go back and be talking specifically about some of these topics. And I think we could pull some of those questions in for that. But Mary Kyle, I think you had your hand up first, and
Oh,
then
can we start with Kelly? Sorry, Kelly's question's been in the chat for a minute.
okay, Kelly, and then
Okay,
Mary Kyle.
so Kelly notes, I appreciate both of the presentations. However, both examples were in very affluent communities with less financial burdens on allocating money for planning and more private money available for hardening standards. Is there any advice for communities that have more financial burdens? And then also Kelly below notes that she asked the questions if there's grants available for this kind of work, for example, replacing roofs, et cetera.
I can just try and respond broadly, Kelly. I mean, those are the types of questions and concerns that I think we need to highlight in our recommendations. So what types of resources, will communities need to ensure, that these types of opportunities are available to a wide variety of residents in their community. So that's definitely duly noted. And there are, grants currently, the Office of State Fire Marshal for defensible space, and they are rolling out additional programs over the next couple of years. The Building Codes Division currently it's a different type of grant, but they have been managing a grant for areas that were impacted in 2020 by the wildfires for rebuilding to fire hardened standards. So, and I think all of the agencies involved in Senate Bill 762 are continuing to see a need for resources, to support communities across the state.
Mm-hmm. And Susan, I was trying to catch up with the chat, so I may have missed if you mentioned access to FEMA pre-disaster funding. And so those up-to-date natural hazards mitigation plans is something that gives communities access to competitive FEMA grant funding that is meant for pre-disaster. So that is mitigation funding. And so there's a possibility, I'm not an expert on how FEMA money comes into local hands, but there is a possibility that money could come from that source.
All right, Mary Kyle.
Thank you. I'm trying to keep this at the level what our recommendations to you as a staff might be, as opposed to diving in too much to the details. And going back to the Tanner Sadie conversation. So if I understand this, is it correct that once the R327 is modified to comply with all of 762 and adopted, that cities cannot go up to which it applies in the high and extreme WUI areas, cannot go above it or below it. But did I hear you say, or should this be a two things for potential recommendations? One, to the extent that a city or county has already adopted something that goes beyond that, should that be allowed to be grandfathered in? And I don't know if Ashland's does or not. I'm not getting into details, but just at the issue, should anything that goes beyond the building codes be allowed to be grandfathered in? Secondly, are there some things that fire professionals would recommend are something that should be done community-wide or in the moderate zones, like the roofing material regulations, or something just a part of that building code that should be required, encouraged, incentivized, something beyond what is the high and extreme WUI zones?
Mm-hmm.
And I gather that on the defensible space side, there's a lot more flexibility for cities and counties and communities to go beyond what might come out of the Oregon State Fire Marshal on defensible code. So anyway, just trying to say that recommendation levels, it would be useful for me as we go forward and make recommendations, what the fire professionals think are the most important things that communities should do, even if they're not in the high and extreme WUI, because just like we can't predict evacuation corridors, we know the wildfires aren't going to stay in those areas over the next decades.
Yeah, I think Ashland's map was so illustrative of that, right? Like they thought they had it mapped and then they looked at the data and the ignition was higher outside the map than inside. But to the building codes recommendation, I think that is certainly something that could be at the level of recommendations, is that currently in place building codes that go above and beyond the standard defined by Senate Bill 762 for implementation of the R327 hardened building standards could be grandfathered in. I think that that is a reasonable recommendation for us to include in the report and for this group to advance. And I'd be interested to hear from any fire officials that we have in this group and on this call, or others with experience, about what might be practical community-wide standards to consider for building hardening. Susan, please go ahead.
Yeah, and can I just add too, I want to, and I see Chad also has his hand up, who is our expert from the Office of State Fire Marshal, just to clarify, for a community that wants to go beyond the minimum standards that the state will be implementing in their WUI code, that set of standards certainly has to be approved by the Office of State Fire Marshal for legal consistency. And then there's a reporting requirement, and they have to show they have the capacity, to take on the implementation and inspection of those areas.
So Chad, were you wanting to answer that question as well?
I think Susan summed it up pretty well right there. Just that the defensible space code will be the state minimum. So, looking at that perspective, it'll be the required minimum. And then if those communities decide to go above and beyond and adopt local ordinance or more stringent code, then just like with the fire code, all fire code amendments have to go through the Office of State Fire Marshal for basically vetting and approval within scope and authority. And then it also, through Senate Bill 762, requires that local fire district or municipality to start reporting to the Office of State Fire Marshal, probably the parameters of where they're inspecting, how they're inspecting, why they're inspecting. And that's under the program development phase within OSFM right now. So it hasn't been fully developed yet, but that will be part of it. And then just overarchingly, when we look at fire risk across Oregon, I think everyone's aware that if you are not in the extreme or high WUI, that fire risk still exists. And OSFM has made it clear that a lot of our grant opportunities, while may have some priority to those high and extreme areas, those other moderate and low areas are open to apply for those grants as well. And we actually encourage it to look at some of those standards, whether it be defensible space or home hardening. So just wanted to put that out there. But thank you. Well said, Susan.
Thanks, Chad. I did want to say, Samantha, you're up next. I want to make sure that we have time for a break before we go on to our topic areas. And this discussion actually leads into those areas, and we'll have more time for discussion in theirs. But I want to make sure we cover the last two, and then we take a 10-minute break. So Samantha?
Yeah, I just wanted to two questions, kind of unrelated, or one, it's not even a question, it's just because I'm not sure if they're on the call, but as we're talking about hardening standards and possibly suggesting that they be applied outside of where they were contemplated in 762, I'd be interested to hear from DCVS on that. And I don't know if they're here, if they were invited. There's a lot.
They were invited. I don't believe they've been able to join.
Okay, well, maybe next meeting we could hear from them directly. And then my other thing is just to the questions in the chat. I understand that's a lot of questions, or we're probably not going to have time to go through all of them today, but it would be good to talk about those and to hear from those who are first responders and emergency responders directly. I just, I get a little uncomfortable when we're talking about planning for emergencies without elevating the voices of those who are actual first responders. And so I just hope that we can carve out some time to get answers to those questions, whether today, tomorrow, or next meeting, or in writing. Because I know we don't need to go so granular as to saying specific block lengths, but having an overall understanding of those answers of what makes things more difficult, what makes things easier when we're talking about emergency response, I think is going to be really helpful for us as we make recommendations.
All right. Chris, did you want to respond to Samantha?
Yeah, sure. I don't, if there is time,
Yes,
I would
please. Of course.
be happy to.
Yeah.
Here, let me just take my hand down and I'll include another comment. So Samantha, I see your questions posted there. The public transit question is a really interesting one. And actually we have had that conversation recently with the Rogue Valley Transportation District. And we know from our survey feedback, when we did our evacuation survey, that, yeah, there are people who don't have their cars. We have a student population of college students here in town who a lot of them don't have their own vehicles. So we're trying to address that. Luckily there's an emergency management position within the local transportation district who's assigned to work on those topics. They will provide bus service for people during an emergency evacuation, assuming that they can safely get into the town if they don't already have a bus here. We also talked with the school district because they do have buses on site in town. So the challenge there is getting their drivers to respond, especially if the emergency is during a non-business type of day when bus drivers would normally be here driving school buses. So it is definitely a challenge when we're trying to address, but something that I think communities really do need to think hard about. The second question on narrow streets and crowded conditions, we saw a lot of that during the Alameda fire. It made it really hard for us as first responders to get around during the fire. I experienced that myself. It was hard to get around traffic, and having places to work in crowded streets where there is fire in an urban interface type fire is a big challenge, because you're trying to provide space for a very wide vehicle. And not only do you have to have the space for the vehicle, but you have to have safe working space around the vehicle for firefighters to access tools, some of which are on the traffic side of the engine. And you connect to hydrants, all the things that we need to do to address fires while we're trying to have that evacuation traffic go down these streets. It is a big challenge. It certainly presents a hazard to first responders to have to work around traffic like that. And even just on what I call, a normal structure fire, there are a lot of challenges around that with narrow streets, definitely on just the response and getting there. But then again, having that safe working area presents a lot of challenges as we continue to want to have more compact urban design, especially in a town like Ashland. With infill, that does create some challenges for both the evacuation traffic management side as well as first responder safety. I think I addressed actually that most of that in your third question, the challenges of evacuating, responding. I do have some, we also go outside of Ashland into the rural areas surrounding town on mutual aid. The challenges aren't as great there because you have a lot more space to work with, and you have very few or a lot fewer people who are trying to use those same evacuation routes. We did not experience nearly the challenges in our urban or in our more rural responses that I've seen in the more urban responses to wildfires. The only challenge there then is just, traffic safety on highways where you've got people moving a lot faster than you do in the urban road network. That certainly creates its own challenges, and getting law and road department to respond to an urban area can take a while at times to establish traffic control points. That's part of the protocols in our responses, but sometimes it takes a half an hour or 45 minutes to get those in place. And then I know your last question, are we planning on allowing for enough shelter opportunities for permanent relocation after disasters? I think our experience here would say know, it's been really challenging. Some people have just picked up stakes and moved away. And a lot of that was our workforce in the valley whose homes were impacted in the Almeda fire. You know, somebody like Pam Marsh could go on a long time about the challenges there, as well as some folks who are working on that issue locally. That's a really challenging one in a workforce limited housing situation previous to a fire like that, and then losing 2,000 housing units makes it really, really hard here in the Rogue Valley for people to find housing, especially those folks who are displaced by the fires. Just one last comment about the rulemaking, and I think you've heard enough about Ashland's experience, that we have gone through feel like we jumped all through the hoops. We've done our homework. We made some hard decisions here to protect our own community, and I would really hate to see that overridden by the Senate Bill 762 adoption. That would send us back to the drawing board. So just a comment from a concerned community that if we did not end up mapped as a high or extreme hazard area, and or per Sharice's comment, if the mapping isn't even including urban areas that have, like ours, who have already adopted a wildfire hazard zone overlay, that could really be disconcerting to some community like Ashland, who has gone through this process if we were sent back to the drawing board. So that's just a comment on the process, in hopes that you'll take that into account and either allow us to be grandfathered in and having already adopted those standards across our community, or another manner for us to retain that, even though our community may or may not end up as a mapped higher extreme wildfire area. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for answering the questions and your deep experience in this topic. Tanner, you have your hand up, and then let's take a break and come back to these topics.
I know we're in a rush, so I'll do this quickly. So to Mary Kyle's question on kind of outside of the high and extreme risk categories, I think it kind of depends. It depends on the situation, depends on the area. So I think an easy way to put it would be, so my understanding is local communities can adopt wildfire community wildfire protection plan, and effectively a map and requirements that are more restrictive than the map and classifications that ODF adopted. That's my understanding. If that happens, kind of to the point that Samantha made, and R327 is referenced, similar to how some of the local communities do it now. So I think Bend, Ashland, and Medford are the three communities that adopted 327 locally. So if a local jurisdiction adopts a map or requirements that are more restrictive, can they reference 327 and have it be applicable? Or is 327 only applicable based on a statewide map? So I think that's kind of an important question. I think something that's good background is when, and this came out during the RAC process with ODF, every 5 years the map will be updated, right, based on current information. And one of the things that's looked at is the current fuel loads. So you could have areas go from extreme to moderate based on fuel loads, whether that's mitigation or fire runs through, whatever. If you're at a lower level, if you go from say extreme down to moderate, and now new development goes in, if it's based on moderate, and so based on moderate, 327 doesn't apply to that development. But we know that in 15, 20 years, fires are going to be, it's warmer, there's more fires, less humidity, or at least there seems to be that trend. And then you add to that fuels that come back in that 5, 15, 20 years, we're setting up potentially developments that are having houses constructed that will last 50, 100 years for a 5-year window on fuel load. So basically to Mary Kyle's point and question, it depends. Thank you.
All right, Susan?
Yeah, just really quick, sorry. Tanner, I do want to clarify, it's my understanding that any community wildfire protection plans or mapping that a community has done will actually be superseded by the statewide map of wildfire risk. There may be maps that can be used locally in terms of, how they're prioritizing, like, investment in fuel reduction projects or other projects. So those projects would still be identified on the map, but the actual risk classification will be that statewide map across the state. And then I also just wanted to note that, we have been meeting with Alana Cox with Building Codes Division, and as Sadie mentioned, she wasn't able to join us today, but we're having ongoing conversations. And it's, a community could encourage this standard outside of extreme and high areas. So that's definitely a pathway, but not, require outside the high and extreme.
All right, so coming up for our discussion topics, the first one is enhancing protection measures and access to funding, and we'll be able to answer some questions that I see that are in the chat during that topic. The second one up is addressing evacuation, and there's some great ideas in the chat that we will carry over to that conversation. And finally, planning for access. So really great discussion and feedback, and I think we all deserve a 10-minute break. We'll come back and get right back at it. So if people can be back online at 11:12, that would be great. Thank you. Hey, Susan, do you mind doing a voice check with me? It's so silent, I can't tell my.
Hi, Libby.
Okay, good. Woo. Check, check.
Mic check, mic check. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, thank you.
Coming in loud and clear.
Yeah. I saw your question. I think we can make sure the question about grants to upgrade the roof to metal, for example, are they given to homeowners?
Yeah.
Yeah. With proof of receipt, or how does that work?
Well, I guess my
Great
point with
question.
all of that was that if the system is where the homeowner has to upfront of that, the reality is that not that many homeowners have the capital to get it done, even though they would like it to get it done. But it's another barrier to really reach out and be accessible.
You have to pay for it up front and have a receipt and get the work done, and
There's check and balances and really come out, in a good outcome.
yep.
Yeah, I see that Melanie shared in the chat that most of the programs are reimbursements, not upfront grants. So that's certainly a point well taken from an equity consideration.
Mhm.
And I mean, I guess if someone that can upfront it, they're more than welcome to do so. There's nothing against that. It's just to get the upgrades needed to survive for some fire would be useful.
So Tammy, I think you can go to the next page. It's 11:15. Hope everybody enjoyed their break. And this is our first topic, enhancing protection measures and access to funding. And Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Turn it over to me.
Oh, you're Sadie. Okay, I have it. I had Susan first, so Sadie.
Well,
go.
I don't think I'll always take an opportunity for Susan's introduction, but I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, got it.
In this case. So enhancing protection measures and access to funding. We wanted to talk a little bit about what communities are doing now in order to get to protect their communities and to have access to different sources of funding. And then some modifications that could be made, and to hear from the group your thoughts about those ideas. So we can move to the next slide.
And I'll just quickly say the three discussion topics, the pace will be information from DLCD, discussion, polling, and hopefully some more discussion after that. So
Thanks, Libby.
yeah.
So what are communities doing today? So right now in Oregon, every county, every city must have a comprehensive plan. So I talked about this back in our first meeting, but if you completely forgot what I said, a comprehensive plan is something that responds to the different statewide planning goals that an area is subject to. So not everybody is responding to all of them. If you're not a coastal county or a coastal city, you don't have to write a plan for your coastal goals. If you're not along the Willamette River, you don't have to write one for the Willamette River Greenway. But otherwise, you have to respond to pretty much all of the applicable goals. And so one of those goals for both cities and counties is Goal 7, and that is areas that are subject to natural hazards. So every county and every city today has what's called an acknowledged comprehensive plan. So a plan in place to address areas subject to natural hazards. They're developed through a community-driven planning process. And again, they are required by the state. So next slide. And then lots of communities, and if Marian is on here, she can tell me if it is everyone, have a natural hazards mitigation plan as well. So the NHMP or natural hazards mitigation plan supports Goal 7 planning. So it supports a city or a county's efforts to plan for areas subject to natural hazards, as you can well imagine. Again, a community-driven planning process. And these are, I referenced earlier in the meeting, these are federally required if a jurisdiction wants to receive federal funds for mitigation projects. Every county, oh, so Marion responded in the chat. Thank you, Marion. Every county has an NHMP, but not every city or special district. So next slide. And then also we have talked about in this call or in these meetings, and maybe you have heard about them in your personal experience, community wildfire protection plans. So community wildfire protection plans are often elements of a natural hazards mitigation plan at a county level by reference, or they can exist for kind of lots of different sizes of groups. So I think we saw in Ashland, and I'll look for a nod from one of our Ashland planners, that there were fire protection plans for kind of, was it as small as an HOA? Is that right, Chris?
HOAs were only governed under individual plans created under the Firewise Communities USA program. Our CWPP is a bit outdated, though. It does exist, and it does cover the entire community and our watershed.
Okay. So community wildfire protection plans are at different scales, but they must be collaboratively developed. They must identify and prioritize fuels reductions areas, and they must recommend measures that homeowners and communities can take to reduce structural ignition. And when you have an up-to-date community wildfire protection plan, or maybe it's just if you have one in general, it can assist a community in securing National Fire Plan grants. So the three documents, we can go to the next slide. The comprehensive plan, the natural hazards mitigation plan, and the community wildfire protection plan can all work very synergistically together. But at current, we have no requirement that they are coordinated at a county level, at a city level, really at any level. And so I think there is an opportunity for us to more closely coordinate these different plans. The benefits would be that all of them fall under the community-driven planning process, that they coordinate land use planning with experts from a variety of fields. The community wildfire protection plans and natural hazards mitigation plans often bring in a broad group of experts from different areas in their creation. So wildfire professionals, fire protection districts, community members, emergency responders, folks from your public works department that talk about road widths and have an idea of what water infrastructure looks like. Really sort of a place to convene a lot of different voices. And what we find is when a comprehensive plan does reference an NHMP or a community wildfire protection plan, those hazards mitigation efforts are made more effective. And overall, having the two white boxes in place, the NHMP and the community wildfire protection plan, increases access to funding opportunities, primarily for mitigation, because those are competitive funds for the state of Oregon, whereas the post-disaster, I think, is a formula fund. That's something that it's not competitive, but our mitigation funding is competitive. So that is, if I'll take any questions, and I have the benefit of being able to defer to my colleague, Marianne Lahav, who is on the call and is an expert in this space. But if folks have any questions about the way those different plans work together, happy to field them, or the elements of any of the above. Happy to. Do I have a list of communities with adopted CWPPs? I know that the Department of Forestry has a list on their website. I don't know how up to date or accurate it is, but I can drop that link in the chat. Great question, thank you. But if I don't see any hands, then I think we can move on to kind of discussion or polling. And the question that we came up with, and I'm happy to hear other questions from the group, but should we, DLCD, should we advance in our recommendations the idea that local wildfire planning efforts be coordinated in a way that minimizes wildfire risk to our communities? And then Libby, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, I will. I did want to note, we had such a great discussion leading into these 3 topics that we have about 15 minutes here per topic, which might not be enough time. So I just wanted to check in with Susan and Sadie that if we have one of these topics that we, we want to talk more in one of these, that we can move one over into our next meeting. So there won't be, okay. So Sadie just presented what it could look like if you go back just quickly, Tammy, for me, just how could communities do this plan? So I think the question on the table is, what do you guys think about that idea? Tammy, you can go back to the question. Is it thoughts, questions? All right, I see a hand up.
Yeah, this is Charisse. I'm sorry I turned my camera on today.
That's okay.
Obviously, the answer is yes.
Yes.
But what I have seen in wildfire planning efforts is that there's a tendency to want to mark off a box, a checkbox that you have done the plan so that you can successfully complete for grants. That is what's most motivating in some cases. And that causes wildfire planning efforts to be contracted out, often to entities that are not locally based or embedded in a community. Therefore, any wildfire planning effort should really be community driven, and the plan should be community written. And that can be quite challenging. It might need a facilitator within the community. So my recommendation would be to focus on coordinated planning efforts through a local facilitator.
Yeah, that's good. A good response. So a plan is not enough. It needs to be developed locally and have buy-in. Kurt. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, they need to be coordinated, and I think one of my takeaways from the presentations from our 2 presenters is the importance of community engagement and the ownership and the educational process that brings with it. And I think this is a subject that could be treated as just another regulation or requirement imposed on the state in communities that may or may not want it. And because everything everything now is so political, and I think it needs to have a community element to it. But we also recognize in that process, there's a chance that communities could say, we're not going to do anything. So that, to me, this is fundamentally about wildfire risk. And so I find that an unacceptable outcome. I look at, and I've said this in our first meeting, I look at the House Bill 2001 process that communities are going through, with the state basically created a series of minimal standards that everybody is required to implement by about now. And then communities can go through adopt above that. And obviously it's not a completely parallel example, but I think it's a good general example of a process that the communities, I'm in Eugene, and the communities in Eugene and Springfield and others have implemented, have been lively and rigorous. And I think that's a good model to look at.
Thank you, Kurt. Mary Kyle, I think you had your hand up next, or maybe it was Amanda. I'm sorry, Amanda, and then Mary Kyle. Sorry, Mary Kyle.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not on camera today, guys, but just to reference again, Amanda Sullivan-Astor with Associated Oregon Loggers. And I think it was you, Sadie, that was just speaking to the need, I think it was, related to community engagement. I don't know. shake your head if it was you, Sadie. I can't, I'm on my phone, so I can't really tell.
Oh, yes, to a degree. I think I was pointing out where it is required in the current planning process and where it is not. So the community wildfire protection plans in their development often include community engagement efforts, but they are not required to. Natural hazards mitigation plans and comprehensive planning is required to respond to goal 1, which is a community engagement goal.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to double down on, so AOL is engaged in the Legislative Disaster Recovery Authority Working Group. And I have also mentioned in that group the need for some sort of standard for local contracting, because I agree that there are issues on the mitigation side and the recovery side related to outside entities coming into our state who don't understand our laws, who maybe don't understand the needs of local community, and unfortunately sometimes are taking advantage of those communities for their own gains, which, I mean, every company has a right to do in a certain sense to make money. But there are a lot of local contractors here and on the mitigation side, whether that's within the WUI, right outside the WUI, or elsewhere related to reducing fuels. Obviously, I'm here to advocate for our members who do that type of work within the wildland urban interface and within the wildland itself. So I just wanted to double down on that comment that was made related to the need for some sort of a local facilitator who could also work with trade organizations like Associated Oregon Loggers and others in the state to ensure that local contractors of all different sorts are getting solicited for that type of work. And then that type of opportunity is getting shared to small businesses who are often hard to reach, where community lists for contractors are not always holistic or accurate.
Thank you, Amanda. Mary Kyle?
I like that this question, at least this is how I'm reading into it, so I want to be clear, is not just land use planning, but planning efforts overall, including things that are adjacent to land use planning. So for example, there was an earlier discussion before the break about evacuation routes and road standards and things like that. And if I understood some of the discussion, and I think it was Chris's description of Highway 99, which is plenty wide, but if there isn't coordinated with who's ever supposed to be doing the traffic management for the emergency vehicles, then, or if it's delayed, so that's just one example. I don't mean to pick on that, but it seems, I am hoping that this encompasses everything that is required to make that planning effectual when it's called upon. So it's not just the land use planning, but it's how it's implemented and utilized by all who are connected to that wildfire planning effort.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the hope. And we'll get into our conversations about evacuation as we have time and capacity today. But when you
I just use that as an example, though.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, but it's a great one. It's very relevant. When you read, I've spent some time looking at a lot of the different community wildfire protection plans for different parts of our state that are available online. And quite often they go through different evacuation routes and identification of roads specifically. I don't know that at current that is tied to their transportation system plan, right? But by coordinating these efforts and by making that conscientious decision, we could move things in that direction. That's certainly the hope.
So Tammy, let's move to polling. I'm not closing out the discussion. I thought we could do a poll and see if there's any more comments.
Yeah, so to again reiterate, how important is it that local wildfire planning efforts be coordinated to minimize wildfire risk? You guys should be seeing a poll pop up here. Give it a couple seconds here while folks respond. Okay, responses are slowing down, so I'm going to, oh, big burst. Couple more seconds. 3,
2, 1.
2, 1.
Good idea, Trish. Okay.
Here
All
you
right.
see, very important for most folks, or at least important.
I would say that's important to most. So thank you for the poll. Does anybody, the person who was unsure, don't know, is there more information that needs to be provided? Dave, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm interested in who's doing the coordinating. Coordination is a scary word for those of us representing rural interests, because typically what coordination means is that DLCD adopts prescriptive requirements that local governments are required to follow, and speaks of the local governments as their partners when there really isn't a partnership at all. If we're talking about coordination between, for example, on defensible space, if we're talking about coordination between the local government and the state fire marshal, I completely agree. But I think you've asked a question that's too vague to really provide a meaningful response.
Yeah, what you're saying is that you just need more information about what that entailed to be able to say if it's important or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think you can. I don't think you can ask an open-ended question about coordinating without knowing the details. The devil on any land use planning question, wildfire or otherwise, the devil is in the details, and so I don't think you get a meaningful answer out of this question.
Mm-hmm. It goes along, I think, with the other comments we've been hearing about this, and I've been reading along in the chat. It's really about implementation. So it's important, but you can see how much the coordination that's implementable and locally focused and empowering for local communities is important. If everybody, oh, we have Dave, your hand is still up, but I think you're, yep. So let's go on. It's 11:35. Let's go on to the next topic, unless Susan or Sadie have anything else they want to add. Oh, we have another polling question. Sorry, all the other ones just have one. So actually, I'm going to call, Trish, you're going to do the poll, but I was going to call on Sadie or Susan to ask this question and just make sure everybody is aware of what we're polling on here. That sounds okay?
Sure, I can do that.
Thanks, Sadie.
Thank you, Libby. And so we've seen some of this in the chat. It comes up in our conversations a lot. There are barriers to local implementation of new plans, and we know that there's been a lot. We at DLCD are specifically aware that there has been a lot that has come down from kind of the state level recently for local government implementation. The reference earlier by Kurt to House Bill 2001 is a good example, and that is related to housing for those that are not in the conversations. And so there are some things that we want to pay attention to as we're moving forward. And so these are some of the categories that, or the elements for prioritization that we came up with. We'd be happy to hear about anything we missed in the chat. But we would love to get a sense from this group about what feels the most important here. So is that adequate state resources to complete the plan? So again, resources is money or technical assistance. That's when somebody works directly with a local government to help get work done. Timely completion of plans. So maybe we have a schedule that we are trying to meet, or communities that we are trying to protect first, or something like that. Again, all of that kind of gets worked out down the road. But if that is something that we should focus on, is making sure that plans are completed in a timely fashion, enabling local governments to qualify for federal funds. So that was, I mentioned it earlier in the natural hazards mitigation plans. Only when those are up to date and approved can a local government access mitigation funding through FEMA. That it be a community-driven planning process. I think we heard some support for that earlier in this conversation. I really appreciate those comments about contractors, and I have a lot of notes, so thank you. And then finally, including experts from many areas in planning. So would love to get your sense for what DLCD should be focusing on the most. And also, if there are other ideas, please feel free to put them in the chat.
Can I ask a quick question before the vote?
Yes, please.
Sure. What should DLCD's recommendations prioritize relative to what? Are we talking about everything that we've talked about so far relative to what risk mitigation, or just the planning process?
That's a great question, Sharice. Thank you. I think my poll window is right over you, so I have the right name. Okay. I'm not going to take the poll, so I'll close out of that. The way we designed this question was really responding to the idea of, I think, coordinating local plans. So in some ways that could encompass quite a bit, because depending on how much is included in a local plan. But again, that's up to local governments to decide. I'm thinking about if DLCD is advancing recommendations to the state around land use planning and coordinating those efforts, and within that, it's local governments incorporating the map to update plans. What do we look at first? What is the most important? I'm not sure if that answers your question adequately, and I apologize if not.
I think it does. You're basically looking at the planning process, not every other topic we've been covering.
Correct.
We have a comment in the chat from Dave. He said he would prioritize reliance upon the agencies with expertise in each subject matter relating to wildfire risk and prevention. And then another comment, prefer that the state resources would be divided out, separating funding from state staff.
Okay, we have about 48% participation here, so I'm going to give everybody a 5-second countdown. You got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here are the results. So most folks, adequate state resources to complete local plans, community-driven planning, followed by including experts from many areas in planning.
Yeah, and I appreciate some people in the chat have said there's not enough information for them to take the poll. These results look like, to me, I would say they're all important, Sadie. Almost all important. So
I tend to agree, but I really appreciate Dave's comment in the chat. One thing that we've kind of keenly felt at DLCD, and I think other agencies as well, and possibly Director Graff, our wildfire programs director for the state, is the need for state agency coordination in this regard. And the Department of Land Conservation and Development does have state agency coordination agreements with many states or with many other state agencies. And many of them have kind of fallen out of date. And this could be a really good opportunity to refresh that state agency coordination agreement and to get it functioning in a way that was more effective in this regard, because I think that relying upon our partners in the enterprise is a huge asset to this kind of coordinated planning and a huge asset to Oregonians. And so I hope we can encourage and see more of it through this process.
I think we should go on to the next topic. I just want to make sure that people have enough space and time to hear what your presentation, and I'm assuming that Sadie, this is back to you.
Actually, my turn.
Susan.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I guess
Thanks, Libby.
adding 0 here. And then we should make sure we have time. I know you have some important information and next steps as well. So
Yeah, I think if we can spend about 10 minutes on this, and I'm just going to do a quick introduction, but if we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so similar to how Sadie talked about areas impacted by natural hazards, we have another statewide planning goal that addresses transportation. So in our recommendations, we're looking at different ways, where we could look at things like evacuation and access through the lens of the state's transportation planning goal. And I've actually invited Laura Buell, who's the land use and transportation planner with DLCD, to join us today. And thank you for waiting, Laura. We went a little over, but to give you an overview of how this statewide goal addresses transportation and how local governments address transportation through local plans. So Laura's going to give us a quick overview, and then we'll have a little time to kind of get back into that conversation around access.
Thanks, Susan. So I was invited a bit last minute to this meeting and asked to give an overview of the TPR. So did you want me to just talk about evacuation, Susan, or give a whole?
I think if you could just explain, what the transportation planning rule is and how it relates to what local governments, do in their local transportation planning efforts. And if there are elements related, to evacuation, that's great. But I think just an overview so folks have an understanding of how it works would be awesome.
Okay, so the TPR, otherwise, that stands for Transportation Planning Rule, and it implements statewide Planning Goal 12, the transportation goal. And it doesn't just tell state and local governments what they need to do in their transportation system plans, also called TSPs, but it has lots of implementation provisions for those TSPs that are actually land use regulations. So the overall purpose of the rule is to coordinate land use and transportation planning with a real focus on increasing transportation choices and reducing reliance on the automobile. And this coordinated land use and transportation planning meets multiple state and local objectives, including containing urban development, reducing the cost of public services, protecting farm and forest land, reducing air, water, and noise pollution, conserving energy, and reducing emissions of greenhouse gases that contribute to global climate change. So there's nothing specific in the rule that talks about evacuation or wildfire, but there certainly are quite a number of provisions that relate to that without coming out and saying it. Especially if those elements are stated clearly in a comprehensive plan or a transportation system plan at the local level, then there are lots of things a community can do to include those aspects. I would say that with only, so the TPR is not a barrier to address, to having evacuation routes or access for the most part. So there are two phases of transportation planning: transportation system planning and transportation project development. I won't talk about project development, but transportation system planning establishes the land use controls and a network of facilities and services to meet overall transportation system needs. And there's several different kinds of TSPs. So there's a state TSP that is done by ODOT. There are regional TSPs that are done by metropolitan planning organizations, otherwise known as MPOs, and counties. The MPOs do the plan for the facilities of regional significance, and counties do the TSP for all other facilities in their jurisdiction. And then there are local TSPs. And there are also coordination requirements in MPOs. So local governments have to coordinate with their MPO on the regional TSP. TSPs must comply with statewide planning goals and also with local comprehensive plans and land use regulations. So that's where a local government could potentially have some specific requirements around access or evacuation. Let's see, let me talk about the implementation of a TSP. I will say that, so a TSP has to meet transportation needs. And in evaluating what a transportation need is, it's not just how much traffic there might be, but a local government can also look at measures. Well, Metro must, and any other jurisdiction may look at land use measures that meet transportation needs. So essentially, those are land use measures that reduce the need to travel. And by reducing the need to travel, you meet your transportation needs because there's less need for traveling. For implementing a TSP, local governments must update their land use regulations to implement the TSP. And they have to adopt land use regulations that protect transportation facilities for their intended use. So this is an area that relates to evacuation. So one of the elements is access control measures. Access control measures are things like driveway and road spacing, median control, signal spacing standards, and also limiting development on rural lands to rural uses and densities. So not overdeveloping rural lands. Other elements that a government shall adopt in their land use regulations, standards to protect future operations of roads. And I'm skipping over some like airports that aren't really relevant here. A process for coordinated review of future land use decisions that would affect transportation facilities. So where are you putting development? A process for applying conditions to development, and minimize impacts on transportation facilities, corridors, and sites, and regulations that assure that amendments to land use designations, densities, and design standards are consistent with the functions of the TSP. One thing I would note is that cul-de-sacs and other dead-end streets may be used as part of a development plan as long as they're consistent with some of the goals of the TPR. So oftentimes codes will allow cul-de-sacs as long as they have a pedestrian or bicycle connection through the cul-de-sac. So that might be something to think about. I don't know how much evacuation is anticipated to be on foot or bicycle versus automobile, but certainly having increased street connectivity is something that would help evacuation routes. And the TPR is not very specific about street connectivity requirements. It mentions it, but it's not very specific, especially street connectivity for automobiles. It mentions street connectivity more in relation to pedestrians and cyclists. let's see.
Susan, I would, and Laura was just wondering, I'm just doing a time check. There's eight minutes left and
Okay,
this,
then
your
I can-
information is very useful, I think, for this group to have a discussion on this topic. So
yeah, so well, I did want to mention one last thing, and that is, so there are there's a requirement for land use regulations in urban areas and rural communities, and the purpose is really to have pedestrian and bicycle friendly development. And one of the requirements is that local government shall establish standards for local streets and access ways that minimize pavement width and total right-of-way, consistent with the operational needs of the facility. So the purpose of this is to reduce excessive standards, to reduce the cost of construction, provide for more efficient use of urban land, provide for emergency vehicle access while discouraging inappropriate traffic volumes and speeds, and to assist in convenient and pedestrian and bicycle circulation. So I'll note that the state, in order to assist in this requirement, produced neighborhood street design guidelines, an Oregon guide for reducing street widths, which is available online. And that was a collaborative process with many, many stakeholders, including emergency response. It did not address emergency, it addresses emergency access, but not evacuation. And it has also been adopted into the Oregon Fire Code for access standards, which is in Appendix D. So that's a helpful guide.
So Laura, I was just going to suggest, because we promised everybody that we end these meetings on time, that
okay,
what
all
you're
right,
talking
I'll
about
stop.
is, well, I was just going to say what you're talking about is so interesting and on point for this group that I would ask Sadie and Susan if we can bring Laura back and give her appropriate amount of time, because you're exactly talking about what I think everybody would like to know, to be able to have a discussion about this topic, the TSPs and evacuations. So I'm looking to Sadie and Susan if we can plan for that.
Yes, Laura, and we'll be more in advance before our next meeting.
Yeah, it's really very
Yes.
interesting. Yeah.
Maybe I can even thrill you all with some slides.
That'd be awesome. That'd be great.
Yeah. And so thank you so much, Laura. And really, I think the point, and we can get into this more at the next meeting, because I think it does really tie very closely in with development considerations, which we'll be spending our next meeting talking about, for the full meeting, because those access standards, ingress and egress and ways we get in and out of our communities, as well as development and ways we might retrofit our communities for safer access and evacuation, will be really important. And I think, like, overarching, just to say that, there are different ways that a community can add standards, to ensure that multiple types of needs are being met. And so,
right, and balancing the concern of everyday safety and health, which is very valid, because of course the behavior of people who drive on wide, high capacity streets results in a lot of death.
So Samantha,
Sorry.
one
Yeah, I
quick
just
thing,
want-
and then we're gonna go to next steps.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say, if we do come back and talk about this, there's a lot of conversation in the chat about the CFEC rules that are set to be adopted in July. And I think if we are going to talk about this, it would be really helpful if we can talk about in the context of what the new Division 12 rules are going to look like versus what things currently look like, because those are going to be changed here in a very, very short period of time. And maybe have a coordination of those two topics, because they are interrelated.
that's a great point. Thanks, Samantha. And, I will also note that, and we could talk about that further, the CFEC climate friendly and equitable community rules are really focused more on urbanized areas. And I think we're looking, more at the WUI and extreme and high hazards, but there is likely some overlap. So
yeah, so those are MPOs. Yeah, any area that's not in an MPO. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I will just say the areas that are going to be high fire risk on the maps are the same jurisdictions that are going to be regulated under CFAC, which includes a number of small rural communities as well.
Hey, Rubio, I saw your comment. Thank you for posting that. So
You're
Susan,
welcome.
do you want to close out the meeting? I was going to say, we have talked about this as a group about how much information there is that this expertise this group has, and we want to offer up to everybody if they would like to talk with one of us one-on-one outside of the meeting. If there's more information you want to share, there's also ways to send information in writing directly to DLCD on this. We don't want to stifle any recommendations and knowledge that you can share with us. So you could let Susan know if you would like an opportunity to talk one-on-one about any of these topics. So I'm back to you, Susan.
Great, thanks, Libby. Yeah, so you can see on the slide, our next stakeholder meeting is June 22nd from 9 to noon. And then we will have our final meeting on August 16th. Next slide, please. And our survey is still open if you haven't taken it. Here's our overall outreach and reporting schedule, our summary, we will be sharing our a draft recommendations report with the Land Conservation and Development Commission at their July meeting, as well as checking in with the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council on July 8th, and then taking feedback from that process, as well as continued tribal consultation, and wrapping that up into the summary report, which we'll be finalizing over the summer, and touching base with you all on those recommendations at our August meeting, and having everything turned in to the council and the legislature on October 1st. Next slide, please. And then just going back to the beginning of our meeting, Sadie talked about kind of the next steps. So this is a very broad brush over a couple year period, but just to note, that those recommendations to the legislature could yield, a further discussion during the 2023 legislative session. So we're in process of, looking at our recommendations and how that might inform legislature in 2023. We then would take the outcome of the session, and if there's rulemaking that we're directed to do, great. If there are also some other programs or voluntary programs, or model codes or resources in the meantime that we can be working on that come out of our recommendations, that's the type of work that the agency can be working on in the interim, kind of voluntary opportunities. And there will be check-ins and opportunities throughout this process for engagement from the public, at our commission meetings. Certainly during the legislative session, people are welcome to testify. And then if we do enter into rulemaking, there will be, a very strong engagement component, some type of rulemaking advisory committee, as well as, engagement plan that will be vetted with our commission and our citizen involvement advisory committee, before going into that process. And last slide. All right. Well, again, thank you everyone so much for your time today. That really, I think we got a lot of fantastic feedback, and there's a lot of great information in the chat and some resources we will also follow up with. We're tracking those requests, as well as some other questions that folks raised that we haven't been able to address during the meeting. But I think that we will be getting back to you with some responses there, and keeping the conversation going. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns, or need additional information, or would like to, have a more focused conversation on any of these topics with a one-to-one. So,
and we'll carry on this topic at our next meeting.
Yes. All right, I think that's all I have, Libby.
Yep. Thank you. We will adjourn.